Opening credits. It was a simpler time, or was it? A nostalgic look back at growing up in the 1960s in a very intertwined family. Written by J.G. Hughes. Narrated by Araceli Gote. Introduction. Take a nostalgic walk with me through a small town in southwestern part of Pennsylvania. You'll be transported back and reminded of what it was like to be a kid in the 60s. It's a steel town with a story about generations of a very intertwined family and their hidden secrets, while discovering stories of the unique brotherhood that only a family of firemen could share. Chapter 1. Monongahela, PA in the 60s. Life in a small town. I was born in 1961, and like both of my parents, I was raised in a suburb of Pittsburgh called Monongahela. It was named for the river that runs through it. That is quite a mouthful. Monongahela, Pennsylvania. It is difficult enough for any adult to say, but even harder for a child. And forget trying to spell it. So they just refer to it as the Mon Valley or Mon City. The river runs through a valley that is lined on both sides with steel mills and iron ore plants with huge smokestacks on them. There are probably hundreds of towns just like this one, all up and down the river. Most everyone in the area worked in either the steel mills or the coal mines. My father worked at a place that made mining machinery. Next to the river, on both sides, are the railroad tracks. They were mostly used to transport coal. And next to the tracks is Main Street. It is lined with little stores that had apartments above them. The streets intersecting with Main Street were numbered. Most of the businesses were between 2nd and 4th Street. You could find just about anything you could need in town. There was a small newsstand called O'Daly's. They had many different neatly stacked piles of newspapers on the floor. Magazines all over the walls and slots, cigars in old boxes, and cigarettes on the wall behind the counter. My father's favorite was this big old metal machine that sat in the corner by the window, the peanut roaster. You could smell them roasting from outside. They came in a small brown paper bag and were still warm. But my favorite was on the front side of the counter. That's where the shelves of candy were. You had to really think hard because you could only have one. Across the street from there was a taxi stand. I think that there was only one big old-fashioned yellow taxi. It always seemed to be there. The buses that came through town heading into the city would also stop there. There was a diner. It was long and narrow and had a long countertop with bar stools. My mom used to call it the Greasy Spoon. She loved their breakfast and strong coffee, but my favorite was their grilled cheese sandwich and a vanilla milkshake, of course, with a cherry on top. There was an Isley's store that sold ice cream cones, Klondikes, and something called chipped chopped ham. It was thinly sliced, almost shaved ham. They would slice it right there in front of you, then wrap it in a piece of butcher paper. Now that I think about it, that was a strange combination of things to sell, ice cream and chipped ham. But they both were famous in that area. The servers all wore white pressed collared shirts with white pants and a white garrison hat and apron. It had a floor made of tiny black and white tiles. It always looked spick and span. Next, there was a 5 and Dime, then Span and Taylor's drugstore. My mother sent me there one day to pick up something for her. It must have been a prescription because she asked me to go all the way in the back of the store to see the druggist. He wore a different style of shirt. It was crisp white with no collar and buttons on his shoulder. She told me that I wouldn't need any money. She said to tell them to just put it on our account. It was before the days of credit cards. There was Miller's dress shop. That's where my mother taught me the art of window shopping. There also was a sewing store. Both of my grandmothers were wonderful seamstresses. One of them bought simplicity patterns. The other would make hers from newspapers. You would never know which was which. One of my favorites was the shoe store, Endicott Johnson's. It was the kind that you sat down and someone waited on you. They measured your foot with some metal thing and then disappeared into a back room, only to reappear with a stack of boxes. They sat on a slanted stool and put them on your feet for you with a shoehorn. My father would shine his shoes every Saturday night before church. I think it was a habit he learned in the military. He would also have his shoes resoled with new heels. People didn't just simply replace everything then. We had church shoes, school shoes, and play shoes. We were told immediately upon getting home to go change our shoes. There was a bakery that we went to every Sunday morning after church to get a fresh loaf of bread for Sunday dinner. My father would usually come home with some donuts too. The smells in there would make you want to buy everything. The donuts were still warm, right out of the oven, so the icing was still runny. Between 2nd Street and 1st Street, there were a few bars that mostly old men frequented. There were also clubs. Later in life, when someone said they were going to a club, it had a totally different meaning. But in this town, there was an Italian club, a Slovak club, a German club, Polish American, any nationality you could think of. They all sold beer and, of course, food. You could smell all the different aromas of food coming from each of them. It truly was a melting pot. My mother's family went to the Italian club. I would see all of her uncles in a yard behind the Italian club playing bocce ball. You could also hear them arguing. There was a different church on each corner. I never realized that there were so many different religions. Each had a tall steeple and beautiful stained glass windows. They were each so ornate and detailed. Each one would have a beautiful manger scene in front of it for the Christmas holiday. Baby Jesus did not show up until Christmas Eve. All the way through town, there were very long, steep staircases going up the hills in between the streets. Some were wooden and some were concrete. They were like shortcuts to everything. We would run up and down one of them to and from church and not even be out of breath. Everyone was so used to using them that it was not uncommon to see older ladies carrying packages up them. It kept you in good shape. Chapter 2. River Hill. There was not a town directly across the river. The steep hillside just shot straight up from the railroad tracks. It was called River Hill. It was covered with trees. It was one way to gauge the seasons. Our front porch faced River Hill, so it was the first thing we would see when you walked out the front door. In the fall, the hillside exploded with color. There were bright hues of reds and golds. It looked like embers in a fire when the sun shone on the hillside. The smell of the air would change with each season. The air became more crisp and smelled of damp leaves in the fall. In the winter, the air smelled of fireplaces burning and you could see your breath. River Hill looked like a black and white photo now. No sign of any color. The winters were so dreary and seemed so long. In the spring, we prayed for the first green leaves to appear after the long, harsh winter. Finally, it all slowly came back to life, becoming greener by the day. It only took one leaf to give you hope that it was almost over. We lived a few blocks up from the hill from downtown Main Street on 2nd Street. On summer nights, when we would have the windows open, the warm summer air would blow in your window, slightly moving the curtains. You could smell hints of night blooming jasmine coming in with the breeze. You could hear the sounds of the railroad horns echoing through the valley. After hearing them your whole life, they did not keep you from sleeping. It became a comforting sound. Chapter 3. Being a kid in the 1960s. You would see all of the fathers leaving early each morning with a lunchbox and thermos in hand. My mother was a stay-at-home mom like most other families in the neighborhood. I was the youngest of 3 kids. I have 1 older brother and 1 older sister. We had 1 car that my father took to work every day. He cherished his cars. There was a carpet remnant over the rubber mats that came with the car. In the winter, he also put out a newspaper over that. We were never allowed to eat in the car and were to keep our feet firmly on the floor at all times. Do not put your hands, lips, or any other part of your face on the windows. He would wax it religiously. He kept his cars for years, but people lined up to buy them when he would finally decide to sell them. We had 1 television. It was black and white, and there was no remote. We were the remote. The oldest person in the room controlled the TV. There were only 4 channels, so the choices were slim. I watched shows like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers. My brother watched shows like Sea Hunt and Gilligan's Island, and my sister liked Star Trek and The Twilight Zone. My father watched old westerns or war movies. We couldn't change the channel even if his eyes were closed. There were very few programs that we could all agree on, but we all sat together each week and watched the wonderful world of Disney. If we were lucky, we also got Jiffy Pop popcorn. I shared a bedroom with my sister, which seemed very common back then. She is 4 years older than me, so she kicked me out of my own room on a regular basis. It also seemed common for an entire family to all share 1 bathroom. My mother, sister, and I would go in and out together. There was always a cloud of hairspray and baby powder in the air, while my brother was on the other side of the door begging for us to hurry up. We woke up to the smell of coffee brewing every morning. We would all come downstairs to eat breakfast. We all wore pajamas with a robe and slippers, always. You didn't come downstairs, as my mother would say, half-dressed. We usually had cereal out of a box, Cheerios or Rice Krispies, usually with a game on the back of the box. My father ate peanut butter toast, but not before dunking it in his coffee. Except for the weekends, we were rushed off to get ready and on our way. No one ever left without kissing my mother goodbye. Chapter 4. My brother's paper route. My brother is 3 years older than me. He got a paper route when he was about 11 or 12. Looking back on this now, it seems crazy the places that they let us go. He had the route that went through downtown on Main Street, but that's how I learned about all of the alleyways that went between the buildings of the businesses. The route started at one end of town. We picked up the newspapers at Pulaski's newsstand. We had to fold each of the papers, then pack them in this big, dirty, white canvas bag that he put over his shoulder. We would walk through town, stopping at each store. My brother would give me newspapers to deliver to the upstairs apartments, while he delivered the papers to the stores below. We also stopped at all of the bars in town. They all smelled of old beer and cigarettes. When you opened the door and the light shone in, everyone would stop and turn to see who it was. They were always very dark inside. One of them always had a huge glass jar of eggs on the counter. I guess they were hard-boiled, but they looked like something out of a scientist's lab. When we got to the other end of town, there were a couple of gas stations and a small restaurant. We had to go past that to a few more houses. Some were on the other side of the railroad tracks. That's where my brother showed me what happened when you put a penny on the track and a train ran over it. He put a penny on the train track, and we continued on our way to deliver the rest of the papers. We heard the train coming. The cars were full of coal. It was loud as it passed, and it seemed huge standing so close to it. When it finally passed, the penny was really flat and stretched out, I saved that penny for years to come. One of the times that I was with him, he must have been in a hurry because he didn't want to wait for the train to pass to deliver the papers to the last few houses on the other side of the tracks. He looked at me and got real serious. He put his finger to my face and said, "You can't ever tell anyone about this." I had been with him on his route many times. He never did this. He said, "You stay right here, don't go anywhere." I didn't know what he was going to do. All of a sudden, he started to run alongside the train. I didn't understand what he was doing. He grabbed the ladder on the side of the train and pulled himself up. I didn't know where he was going or when he would be back. I just stood there, scared. He went in between the two cars and jumped off of the other side. I could catch quick glimpses of him when I looked under the train. It finally passed, and I could see him walking back. I couldn't believe that he did that. He threatened me again. "Don't you ever do that, and don't ever tell anyone either." Later in life, I can remember seeing movies like Stand By Me that reminded me of those times. I think about it now, how dangerous it was, especially for how young we were. But he must have done it often because he was very good at it. At some point, 2 dogs from our neighborhood adopted my brother and just started following him on his paper route. They weren't even our dogs, but eventually they just stayed on our front porch most of the time. They would show up early in the morning and wait for my brother and walk with him to school. He thought that they stayed at school all day waiting for him to get out because they were there on the playground when school let out. Later, my mother told us that they would come back home shortly after we went to school, lay on the porch, and then, just before school would let out, they would just get up and suddenly leave, like they knew what time it was. Dogs just ran loose then. They just hung out with us like a part of the gang. Chapter 5. The Neighborhood Kids. The families in the neighborhood had mostly families of boys. If I didn't play with the boys, I had no one to play with, so I turned into quite a tomboy. My neighbors, Joey and Richard, were brothers. Then Frankie, Stephen, and John were brothers. Also Johnny. He had a brother named Teddy that was much older and wanted nothing to do with us. The house right across the street had Jeffrey, Randy, and Ricky. I can remember that my mother once said that Ricky was slow. I didn't know what she meant by that. As young children, he didn't seem much different from the rest of us. Later, my mother would explain that there were some complications in childbirth and he was deprived of oxygen, so now he was slow. When we would play ball, the other kids could be so mean to Ricky. They never wanted him to be on their team. Ricky would get upset and run home. It would not be long before his mother would come out. She would yell, "If Ricky can't play, none of my kids play." Everyone respectfully replied, "Okay, Miss Gio, sorry," and Ricky got to play. We had a basketball hoop attached to the peak of our garage. There was always a game going on in our driveway. Sometimes it was basketball, sometimes square ball. There was a church on the corner with an empty grass lot behind it. It was next to our driveway. The church owned the grass lot, so we called it the churchyard. We played there a lot when it was some game that we would likely end up on the ground. In spite of the grass, we were usually covered in road rash and always seemed to have skinned elbows and knees. We had to be quite the sight. Stretched out, hand-me-down shirts, bandaged knees, and calamine lotion on our bug bites, or worse, poison ivy. Just about everyone eventually flew over the handlebars of their bikes trying to master handbrakes. Stitches seemed to be a rite of passage. It gave us war wounds to brag about. We lived in a neighborhood where everyone seemed to be of similar income. It was very modest. Most were blue-collar workers. Everyone in the neighborhood went to the same local public school. We all walked to elementary school together, which was only blocks away. Jeffrey, Ricky, and Joey were all in the same grade as I was. It was a very old school. I think our parents even went to the same school. I graduated high school with most of the kids that I started kindergarten with. We played different kinds of ball in the street. It usually was where all of the mothers could see us. If any one of them yelled at us, you would listen to them like it was your own mother. Now and then, a car would come down our street. Whoever saw it first would yell, "Car!" and we would all step back up onto the curb until it passed. We would sit on the steps of our front porch eating popsicles. The ice cream man would come around in the summer months. When we would hear him coming, everyone would drop whatever they were doing and run home in a panic, looking for loose change, afraid that they would miss him. My mother came outside on the front porch and would whistle with her fingers when it was time to come home for dinner. We would climb the neighbors' trees just to eat the fruit. We all wore high-top Converse and rode banana seat bikes. I was closest to Jeffrey across the street. We even looked a lot alike. So much so that my brother convinced me that I was adopted. He told me that the Geos next door were my real family. He had convincing evidence. He said that there were hardly any pictures of me as a baby. He said that they just couldn't afford any more kids. So Mom and Dad took me in. When I told my mother that I was going to live with my real family, she slapped my brother on the back of the head. Chapter 6. Telephone Cans. Jeffrey, Ricky, Joey, and I all went through elementary school together in the same class. One day, we learned about how you make a telephone out of a string and 2 cans. We decided that we would try it. Our houses were directly across from each other. Both were 2-story houses. Our bedrooms were directly across from each other. We found some twine and 2 cans. We measured the string to make sure it was long enough. I took the whole tangled mess up to my bedroom, pushed the screen out far enough for the can to fit through, and pushed it hard enough so that it would roll off of the roof. The first part was much easier than the second. Jeffrey and his brothers went up to their room and hung out of their bedroom window. We threw the can up and it just rolled back off of the roof. We did it many times. Everyone took turns giving it a try. Finally, they were able to grab it. Our mothers probably would have stopped this whole process if they had caught us in the act. Once it was up there, they did not seem to mind it. This was just the beginning of learning that it was better to ask for forgiveness than permission. This one definitely would have gotten shot down. Now we have to test it. I ran in the house and quickly went upstairs. I dove across both beds and grabbed the can. I asked them, "Can you hear me?" I put the can to my ear, and I could. I could hear them. Now, looking back, our houses were so close together, I could probably just hear them without the can. It was fun for a while. We kind of forgot about it after some time went by, until one day, a very large delivery truck came up the street. It caught the line going across to each window, yanking the line, causing the cans to pull the screens out of the windows. The cans clanged as they were being dragged down the street like they were tied to the back of a honeymoon couple's car. I was told that from now on, I was to ask first, no matter what it was. Chapter 7. Rosie's Candy Store. There was a corner candy store in every neighborhood. Ours was called Rosie's. We would take dirty pop bottles that we found by scavenging the hillsides to the candy store and return them in exchange for candy. She would tell us to start picking, and I'll tell you when to stop. The display was glass. Our faces could barely see over the bottom. There were loose pretzel rods with no wrapper, fireballs, candy cigarettes, bubblegum cigars, and Tootsie Rolls. We came out of the store with our bounty in a small brown paper bag. We would sit on the step and inspect our treasure. There was bazooka bubblegum, pixie sticks, wax lips, and paper dots. I can smell them now. As we got older, we were allowed to go a little farther than our local neighborhood. Our adventures were different every day. We never knew where we would end up. Sometimes we would end up in the woods discovering where the trails would lead. Sometimes we went downtown, cutting through the alleys in between the tall buildings. Behind one of the buildings, we discovered huge cardboard boxes. We later learned that it was an appliance store. I wondered if we would get in trouble if we took them. I looked around. They seemed to be left for trash. So we grabbed a box and started dragging them home. We made clubhouses out of them and played in them all summer. Sometimes we would ride our bikes for miles. Most of the streets were brick, always very hilly, windy roads. We would pedal uphill, and when it got hard to pedal, we just stood up to pedal. It was worth it because when you got to the top of the hill, you would fly downhill like the wind. Those same hills that we rode the bikes up and down were also the best ones for sled riding on. When they would cancel school because of snow, we would all bundle up with at least 3 layers of snowsuits. We had hats, scarves, and Town Talk bread bags on our feet to keep them dry. We looked like the kids from the movie A Christmas Story. Not everyone had a sled, so sometimes we would double or triple up on one sled. We just got very creative and used a garbage can lid. It didn't seem to matter what it was. In the fall, people would rake up all of their leaves into piles on the side of the road. We got great pleasure out of riding our bikes through them. I'm sure that they were not too happy with us. Chapter 8. Mom and Dad. As a child, my mother lived out in the country, a place called Valley Inn. She was born in 1935. Her and her brothers and sisters lived in a big house that all of the relatives seemed to end up at. She said that it was a happy house. Her father worked in one of the many mills in the valley. My grandmother was always cooking. Everyone was always welcome. Many people would end up staying there when they needed a place to stay. They eventually moved closer to town, into Monongahela. My father was born in Monongahela in 1934. He was raised in a much different environment. They lived on the other end of town, only a couple of blocks from the high school. They had a small family. He only had one sister, Kay. My father was tall, 6'2", and very lean. His pictures reminded me of Jimmy Stewart. He was fair with light gray eyes. My mother had thick, shiny black hair with olive skin. She was not much more than 5 feet tall. She was very shapely, the Jane Russell kind of shapely. My father's cousin Sam was dating my mother's sister Peggy at that time. My father was in the same class with her brother Bill in high school. My Uncle Bill told a story about the time my father took my mother out on a date. Her father had locked the screen door so he would know if she came home late. Well, they were late. Apparently, my father cut the engine to the car to quietly drift into the driveway. When my mother tiptoed to the front door, she realized that the screen door was locked. When she couldn't open it, she turned to look at my father. He quietly got out of his car and opened the trunk of the car where he kept a small toolbox. He quietly removed the screws and took the screen door off of the house. Once my mother slipped in, he reattached the door, and then she quietly crept up the stairs, and he quickly took off. They were married when they were 19 and 21 years old. He enlisted in the Army, and they were stationed in Seaside, California. My sister was born there. When my father was discharged from the service, they returned to Monongahela. My father had no job, and my mother was pregnant with my brother. He soon was employed by a company that made mining machinery and eventually moved into a house across the street from my mother's brother Bill and his wife and her best friend, Emily. Chapter 9. My mother's family. We lived within walking distance of most of my mother's family, except 2. So most of my cousins also went to the same elementary school that we did. We also all attended the same church. If that wasn't enough, my father and most of my uncles were all volunteer firemen and worked at the same plant making mining machinery. So, at almost any event, whether it was church-related, school-related, or fireman-related, several of my family members were always there. Whenever there were family gatherings of any kind on my mother's side of the family, They would welcome you with open arms. They would pick you up, jostle you around, and kiss you all over before putting you down or passing you on to the next person. There would always be a lot of chaos, but happy noise. The grown-ups were always in the kitchen laughing. They usually would suddenly get quiet when children came in. They would ask you what you wanted and then send you on your way. To this day, I always wondered what they were talking about. We were sent outside to play in the warmer months, or to the basement to play with all the other kids when it was cold. There was always someone your age to play with. It was a very happy, fun, and loving atmosphere. We never sat down at a table to eat. There was just never enough room, and too many of us, so it was always buffet style. My mother's side of the family would always have a Christmas party. Each year, they would take turns deciding who would have the party that year. When we had it at our house, it was so exciting. We made sure that everything was decorated perfectly. There was food everywhere on every counter. When each relative came in the door, I had to take their coats and go put them on my mom and dad's bed. Then later, they would try to figure out whose coat was which in the mountain of coats. The adults laughed loudly while the kids played with a racetrack in the basement, or played in the living room where the Christmas tree was. Many of us also were in the Christmas Eve service together at church, while the rest of our families were in the pews watching. I loved all of it. My mother was one of 6 children. The oldest was her sister Elaine. She was the one aunt that did not live in town. She was the only fair one. The rest of them all looked very European, so they called her Irish. She lived out in the country. It was a few miles from town. There were dairy farms in the area of her house. You had to drive up a long, steep driveway. There was a huge tree at the top by her house. There was a full double swing that hung from the tree. We used to swing as high as we could and then jump off into the air. It felt like you were flying. She drove a truck before trucks were cool, especially for a woman. She had lots of land, so we could just run wild. I loved it there. They had an arbor that formed a tunnel that they grew grapes on. There were berries growing wild everywhere. We would walk forever just picking berries and eating them. My mother, Aunt Elaine, and Nanny would make jelly from the grapes and berries. I'm pretty sure they also made wine from the grapes. I was told that their father was once famous for his homemade wine. They took me once to see the baby lambs when they were born. I sat on the ground in some stinky old barn, and they placed one of them in my arms. I was in heaven. I was very much at home there with all of the animals. The next one was her brother Bill. He married my mother's best childhood friend, Emily. Uncle Bill and my father were also good friends in school. Growing up, they never lived more than a couple of blocks from us. If ever my mother would not be home, she would just send us to one of the relatives' houses after school. You always felt at home and loved it at Aunt Emily and Uncle Bill's house. Uncle Bill smoked a pipe. Years later, I would smell candles that reminded me of that pipe. I'm not sure if it had anything to do with them all being very good friends growing up, but they treated us like their own. The next was her sister Peggy. She married my father's first cousin, Sam. For years, Aunt Peggy lived in a mansion that had been converted into apartments. Their mother, Nanny, also lived in one of those apartments. The next was her brother Jack. He looked just like his dad. I remember him singing in the church choir. My mother loved to hear him sing. He only lived a couple of blocks from us and Uncle Bill. The youngest brother was Don. He was the only one who left town. He moved to the city right out of high school. My mother and I had to go into the city to see an ear specialist for me. She would plan to leave very early and take the bus. We would always meet Uncle Don for lunch at the Woolworth's lunch counter. We saw his apartment once. It looked out at the city. I had never seen anything like that. You could see lights everywhere. Even all of the bridges were lit up. Those apartments reminded me of something you would see on TV, like the Bob Newhart show. They definitely lived differently than the rest of their family. Chapter 10. Great Aunts and Uncles. We were also very fortunate to have multiple generations. My mother's mother, or nanny, moved from Italy with her 4 siblings when she was 18. They also all lived close to each other. I suppose that they started having children at a young age because there didn't seem to be much of a huge difference in age between my aunts and uncles and theirs, so most of them were at all of the family gatherings too. It was not unusual to see my great-uncle Chuck rolling around on the ground, wrestling with the boys, and he usually got the best of them. Sometimes, extended family would be there too. My Aunt Emily's brother Bud and his family were always there too. It got so confusing trying to figure out how you were related to all of these people that you stopped trying. I met my best friend, who I have known for most of my life, in kindergarten. It was a while before I found out that our grandfathers were brothers. My mother's father was one of 4 children, and of course, all of them lived close by. My mother's father died long before I was born, so we did not interact as much with that side of her family. My mother seemed to just love spending time with her aunts and uncles. We would visit them often. Nanny, her mother, was very much a typical Italian grandmother. She was always making homemade pasta and baking bread. All of the surfaces of the house would be covered with bed sheets and covered in flour for drying pasta. My mother said she baked bread daily to make sure that there would be enough to make sandwiches for everyone to take to school or work. My mother said that her father brought home some store-bought bread from time to time. They thought it was so special. Now, what we wouldn't give for that homemade bread. She was very short and round and always wore an apron. Her hair was salt and pepper, colored and wiry, seldom styled. The youngest of her sisters, Marianne, was very different. She was petite, slender, and very health conscious. She wore side zipper cotton pants and little white keds, and usually a headband or scarf in her hair. She didn't wear makeup, but always looked very pretty. She only had 1 child. We called her the witch doctor of the family. She always had a natural remedy for everything. She always had an unbelievable garden of herbs and vegetables. The middle sister, Margaret, was the polar opposite of Nanny. She didn't like cooking or even seem domestic at all. She was very slender, almost anorexic. She usually had a cocktail in one hand and a cigarette in the other hand. I used to think she dressed like a movie star in high heels and form-fitted dresses. Her hair was perfectly styled. Her voice was deep and raspy from smoking. I remember how she would throw her head back and laugh loudly like Cruella de Vil. Their brother, Charles, was like a jungle gym. He was fun, funny, and always wrestling and roughhousing with the kids. I was told that he had a son by his first wife, Estelle. She was from another large Italian family in our town. He loved her dearly, but she died during childbirth. His then-wife's sister somehow always blamed him for her death. She would raise the baby, and her family vehemently hated him until he died. His son Charles went by Sonny. We were told that later in life, he got involved with the mafia, so seldom if he ever came back home. The other brother, Silvero, was tragically killed when a huge boulder broke loose from a hillside above a highway. It rolled down the hill, crushing his car and killing him. He had 2 very young girls. The girls ended up staying with Nanny, their aunt, so their mother could work. My mother said it was great fun, like having 2 new sisters. My mother said that her mother took anyone in. She was always cooking, so what was one more mouth to feed? It just seemed to be what they just did, without even thinking. Someone just took the kids in. I grew up going to school with one of those cousins' kids. Once again, not even knowing that they were related to me. Chapter 11. The Family That Always Comes to the Rescue. When I was about 4 years old, my mother became very sick. She had suffered from ulcerative colitis for some time. Now it was cancer. The local hospitals felt that she had a much better chance in one of the more well-known teaching hospitals. She was sent to Johns Hopkins in Maryland. My father had to continue to work, or we would have lost everything. So, once again, the relatives just swooped in and each one of them took one of us. I went with my Aunt Elaine. She had 2 kids, both close to my age. My brother went with Aunt Peggy, who had a son a year younger than my brother. My sister went to Aunt Emily's, who had 2 girls at that time. It was familiar, and we always felt loved. My siblings may have understood better what was going on, but I didn't really know what had happened. My father spent time driving back and forth to the hospital in Maryland when he could. She ended up having to have a total colostomy. As a result of the surgery, she also had 2 strokes, leaving her one side paralyzed. She was only 33 with 3 children under 8. My father said she was down to 87 pounds, and they did not think she was going to make it. The doctors advised my father to bring your children and let her see them. It wasn't looking good. My father packed us all up in the car with his mother. My father had an uncle and aunt. It was one of my grandmother's brothers who lived in the Maryland area, so that is where we would stay. I don't remember seeing my mother. I suppose I would not have recognized her, but for some reason, after seeing us, my mother continued to get better and stronger. I'm sure it was quite some time, but she eventually came home. She was in a wheelchair with braces on her legs. Her one hand did not work, so she had to go to physical therapy often. There were always people coming in to help. People brought food and got my brother and sister off to school, but at least we were finally able to come back home and be together. Both of my grandmothers would come to stay off and on to help. Eventually, my mother was walking on her own, just with a slight limp. Aunt Emily took me to school to register me for kindergarten, and now we were all going to be in school. My mother got better and better as time went on. I never really considered her to be handicapped. There didn't seem to be much of anything that she couldn't do. Chapter 12. My first funeral. When I was 8 years old, my mom's mother died suddenly of a heart attack. She was only 60. It was the first time that I ever knew anyone that had died. I had never dealt with death. I didn't really understand all of it, but I would have to learn that it was just a part of life. I overheard the discussion about whether they would take me to Nanny's funeral. Some argued that I was too young, while others said that I needed to say goodbye. I remember them briefly taking me to the funeral home where I saw her in the casket. I don't think that I really understood, but I didn't need to. I could see that everyone was very sad and upset. You could just feel it. I had never seen all of them like this, especially seeing my mother crying. I think that had been more upsetting to me than Nanny dying. Soon, my mother's sister Elaine became ill. It was some sort of cancer, and it was very aggressive. It was not long at all before she passed away. I remember my mother saying that now she was grateful that her mother had died first. Years later, I would understand what she meant. Her sister was only 38. Her children were very young. Shortly after that, I came home from school one day, and there was her daughter, Kimberly. She was one of Aunt Elaine's 2 children. My mom just said that she would be living with us for a while. Just like that. Like all the others had done before. Her brother Bobby was 4 years old and stayed with his grandparents. They lived in a trailer on the same property as Uncle Robert. Kimmy lived with us for some time. A few years prior, my mother's Uncle Don, her father's brother, had died, leaving her Aunt Alice widowed with 4 kids. Now, this gets complicated. My mother's sister Elaine, who had just passed at 38, left her husband Robert with 2 kids. He ended up marrying her Aunt Alice. Everyone thought it was a great solution for both of them. It was definitely a marriage of convenience. He needed a mother for his kids, and she was financially desperate. So Kimberly moved back home with her dad and Aunt Alice. Unfortunately, their marriage didn't last long. My father always said that Uncle Robert never treated Aunt Elaine right, so he was sure that he wasn't good to Alice either. Later, Aunt Alice moved in with her daughter. My mother would still visit her often. Chapter 13. It's Not So Scary. There was a ritual that happened every spring, but even more so now that Aunt Elaine and Nanny had died. My mother always went to the cemetery every spring and planted flowers on all of the relatives' graves. She would bring all the tools and plants with us. While she was planting, we would roll down the hills in the soft grass. It just smelled like fresh mowed grass. After planting all of the flowers, she would say, "Come on, let's go visit the relatives." We would walk with her all through the cemetery, and she would explain how each one was related to us, and usually how they died. I know it sounds funny, but it was one of the most beautiful cemeteries. It was way up on a hill with the most beautiful views and the softest grass. In one part of the cemetery, there was a huge pond with a statue in the middle of it. We would always catch tadpoles in it. There was a section that was so old it had Civil War graves. It was so well kept up. They did not allow plastic flowers. Funny, it was where everyone went to learn how to drive. My mother said we didn't have to worry about killing anyone. I think because she took us there so often and told us all of these stories, it was never a scary place to us. It was beautiful. I guess as a child, she didn't live very far from that cemetery, so they would run through it playing too. She made a lot of things less scary for us. We would sit on the porch during thunderstorms, oohing and awing like we do watching the fireworks. I love the smell of those first raindrops hitting the pavement. We would swing on the porch swing, singing songs that she had taught us, but I never felt afraid of lightning. To this day, I love to watch a good storm.